Brian Grimm, thank you so much for your time to speak on the Real Clear Values podcast.
So glad to be with you, Tom.
It's great to be catching up, Brian, and I'm really particularly interested in speaking with you because you, I imagine, have got a lot to say. Well, you certainly have said a lot about the value of religion, and it's something that I think is very topical at the moment in the world that we live in, and how we look at different religions, how we look at the interactions between different religious people and people who are non-religious as well. So, Brian, you are the president of the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation. So perhaps a good place to start is if you tell us a little bit about your organization and the mission that it serves.
Yeah, so the main purpose of the organization is to help people see that when everybody is free to have a faith or change their faith or even have no faith at all, that has positive benefits for society, both socially and economically, and even security-wise. So where you have a society that's characterized by giving each other that kind of freedom, you have less conflict, less violence, and where there's more peace and stability, that's good for everything, right? Not just good for our own lives and the pursuit of our dreams, but it's also good for business. Except for bullet and bomb makers who profit off of violence, most normal business is really spurred on by peace and security. So that's one mission, to share those empirical findings with others. And then we work directly with some of the biggest companies in the world, many of whom, name brands you would recognize, helping them to make their workplace an environment just like that as well. So where you have a workplace where people, as the mantra goes, bring their whole self to work, or as Hadi Sharifi, he's the head of the Muslim group at the Intel Corporation, he says, bring our whole soul to work. Then, or whatever your beliefs are, it can be, if you're an atheist, to not have to hide that. If you're a Baha'i, not have to hide that. If you're a Wiccan, not have to hide that. Or if you're an evangelical Christian, not have to hide that. So whatever the faith or belief, when you feel like that's welcome, that creates an environment where you want to give your whole soul to work, so to speak. And what employer wouldn't like that?
Absolutely.
And it works better for the people who are more motivated. So they're retained. So it's good for retention. It's also good for recruitment, because people will hear, oh, that company welcomes people like me and my kind, whatever my background is. And then that results in increased revenue, because you've got teams, more motivated, people, and you also have teams who are accustomed to sort of sharing on deeper levels of values and beliefs, and that creates a different kind of relationship than when your only conversation is limited to the work product. Then your workers better, you feel like you want to stand up for them. You'll even want to serve them, and be part of a helping environment. So that's in short what the foundation does. We work on sort of the studies to show that this is good for business, good for society, and then working with businesses to see practical ways that they can implement this in ways that then not only are a model for society, but can spill out over into society, so that what happens in a company that's good can benefit all of society as well.
This is really interesting, this idea that you can quantify and make a business case in favor of this, in favor of faith, in favor of religion, and people bringing, like you say, the whole selves, the whole souls into the workplace. So how do you go about showing that? What sort of evidence do you adduce to show and make the case that this is a good thing?
So different kinds of evidence, three different kinds. One is just general studies across companies. McKinsey and Company do a lot of workforce satisfaction, workforce retention studies. and where people are able to bring their whole self, their whole soul to work, it results in more effective, diverse teams. So you can have a diverse team, but if they're all hiding, their identities from each other, then what's the benefit of that diversity?
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
so that's one, like the McKinsey and Company does that. A second is that in some of our own studies, we looked at where you have religious diversity included as part of the diversity, equity, and inclusion. So where religion's included, does that result in more emphasis on other diversity categories like race and gender and sexual orientation and disabilities, things like that? And the answer is yes. So where you've included faith, it doesn't diminish from other diversity categories. In fact, it sort of buttresses it, because people of faith often become allies of others just out of, from their sort of moral teachings. Not that other people aren't moral, no, not at all. But when you are allowed to bring your faith, so to speak, to work, then all the things that, whatever your faith is, the golden rule, treat others as you would have them treat yourself, at a very basic, then it's like, oh, I need to be accountable how I act to my neighbor, who's a coworker. So it then brings in other, you could say, virtues that people aspire to, brings that into the workplace. And then the third is just the accumulation of case studies. So often in business, that's how you teach, if you're a business student, what's the case study for this? So we have just case study after case study of companies that have done this, and the results from that, and the results are overwhelmingly positive. And I'll just footnote that it doesn't mean that this happens automatically. You can't, if you just say, oh, we're going to do religion at work, what does that mean? We're going to start having, mass. I'm Catholic, so we're going to start crossing ourselves, before every board meeting. What does that mean? And so I think the companies that do this well have thought about it deeply as well. And it's not about replicating church or mosque or synagogue or whatever your faith is, and it's not about being pro-religion above pro-non-religion. It's just giving people a faith, a space where they can feel comfortable and include belief in that. So if someone's an atheist, those beliefs, it's different than an agnostic, right? Because agnostic is like, well, I'm not quite sure. I'll stay open. Maybe my views may change. Whereas if you say I'm an atheist, you've come to a firm belief, and so that can be just as welcoming within this faith and belief category. But again, you have to think about that. Does including religion mean we exclude non-believers? No, quite the opposite. It makes a space for whatever your belief system is to also have a voice.
Yeah, very interesting at enabling and empowering, if you like, each individual to really come as they are and not feel like they have to compartmentalize themselves into work, who they are at work versus who they are elsewhere in the rest of their lives, especially with things that are so fundamental as religious beliefs or non-beliefs for that matter, because there are people who are passionately not believers in like manner. So this is quite interesting, Brian. I'm interested in the question as well about religion and where it is in society today, where it is in the world today. And very much your work seems to me, broadly speaking, I watched your TEDx talk as well, it very much seems about defending religion as well, and not just like you already alluded to, not just one particular religion. So this isn't you just defending Christianity or the Catholic Church. You're talking much more broadly than that. So I'd like to talk a little bit now to the need for a defense of religion. Is there a need for that, and if so, why and what does it look like?
Well, I would say that the greatest defense of religion is to truly practice one's faith.
Mm,
And so just from my faith, and it's not, I mean, it's similar to what other faiths teach. What are the two greatest commandments? You know,
mm,
Jesus was asked that once, and the answer was, well, to love God with all your whole heart, soul, and strength and mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself.
mm,
And so, you know, in that, if I'm loving my neighbor, um, that is the best, you could say, defense of religion, because if religion is not doing what it's supposed to be doing as a
mm.
believer, I won't say religion's, you know, that's a big term, but just
Yeah,
each person and their faith not living that out on the
mm,
very basic commandments,
yeah,
the basic, not, and they're not even commandments like, no, that, you know, that's pretty straightforward. Love God, love your neighbor.
hmm,
I mean, that you can do a lot with that. And so
yes,
if you think of a workplace, well, what would that mean if I'm starting at a new job or I have a job? What would that sort of principle mean in my workplace? Well, it means whenever I see somebody who's having a tough day, hey, can I help?
mm,
You know, or I see that you didn't quite get that project done right. Um, could I give you some tips, or could I help you? You know, instead of
mm.
looking for a way to undercut the other guy, you know,
Sure,
or
yeah,
so if there's no, does that love need defense?
mm, mm. It's a good question.
Because do I, what holds me back from putting those two most important commandments, according to my faith tradition,
Mm,
to practice?
mm,
Nothing, right? I mean,
mhm.
you can lock me in chains. Please don't, but you can lock me in chains and say you're going to die tomorrow.
Mm,
Can I still practice the two core tenets of my faith?
mm,
Absolutely, I can still love that neighbor, um, and I can still love God. That might be challenging to do in that situation,
mm,
but you know, and that's what sort of so many stories of saints and other people who have lived that way, and in my faith tradition, you know, we call them blessed today for
mm.
having lived such a life. So I mean, there's other sides to many other, you probably didn't expect that answer the question that way.
No,
um,
it's a very good answer, and it's one that I think cuts right to the heart of the best defense that one can present or muster against an attack is in the action. It's in the principle. It's in the thing that is irrefutable, and love, if it really is love, is irrefutable. You can't make a good case against it. You can't
yeah,
look at it. You can't look at its antithesis and say that is a better alternative than love.
yeah,
And so
yeah,
it is irrefutable. So on that grounds alone, you've kind of won the argument in terms of, is this a good thing or not?
yeah,
Um, what I would say as well is that it shines a light on things as well. It shines a light on where the possible attacks are coming from and the nature of those attacks, because sometimes they come from a place of real malevolence. And I
mhm,
think that it's useful to be able to, from your point of view, and from mine as well, because I'm also a Christian, although from a different denomination, to show that Christ-like forbearance
mhm,
and perseverance as well. Now, and that is, it takes an incredible amount of self-control to do that, especially when under duress.
yeah,
But it really is irrefutable. You can't argue against it, and people have tried to argue against it. I mean, goodness,
yeah,
if you read the works of Nietzsche, for example, he gave it a pretty good crack. If you read his works, and how he really did argue against what he called slave morality, because he
mhm,
saw this as, he saw things as such as love and service and kindness and forgiveness as being subversions to the masters, the nobles, the noble class of Romans, so to speak. Now, I mean, it's a real leap that he
yeah,
presents, but he gave it as good a shot as he could, and he came up short. Essentially, that there is no solid argument against love. So in terms of defending religion, if that's what you really believe and love is at the core of it, then that's an excellent answer. I'd just like to dig in a little bit more, Brian, on some of the threats that are posed to religion, maybe from wider forces, from governments and other such groups. What are those threats today? What do they look like today, and how's that changed since you gave your TEDx talk? I think it was in 2013, wasn't it? So nearly 10 years ago now.
Yeah, I have a little more gray.
Me too.
In that TEDx talk, it was given at the Vatican. It was an interesting event in itself, and I pointed out the two different ways that sort of religious freedom is under attack, or where you can find religious freedom constrained. And one is by the actions of governments, policies, laws, or practices, even if they're not codified, and then societal actions that are sort of social hostilities involving religion. That can be everything from trying to, prevent other religions from being able to operate in your neighborhood or your country, or hate acts motivated by hatred, whether it's physical abuse or other types of abuse. So the biggest thing that has changed over the past decade, you could say, was really the rise of these social hostilities, and they have changed in different forms, and so they're different. Government restrictions are about the same. So sort of this rise of social hostilities was fed after 9/11, September 11, 2001. That's when we really saw a lot of that social hostility involving Islamic related or terrorism. So that was a driving force. It was both the religion related terrorism and the societal response to that. So you got the action and reaction to that. So that was the driving narrative up until a few, maybe 6 years ago. But around that time, we've really seen the rise of religious nationalism, and so those forces, some of which might seem benign, but usually they aren't, because religion doesn't have, religions do not come out of or limited to a country or nationality, or an ethnic group or anything like that. So they aren't, if I can say this, they're not designed to be owned by a particular nationality, race, or other grouping. And so we've been seeing that with that was with the mass migration after the Middle East, the different conflicts. Then there was a reaction not just against Islamic terrorism, but against immigration. So that immigration, that attempt to keep our country purely whatever it is, then starts to treat the other and their religion as an enemy. So these are factors that, of course, operate throughout history, but have come to the fore in a variety of ways in a variety of countries. So in Europe, this has been a trend, and then in the United States, a trend. In certain Latin American countries, a trend, and then you get to countries like India, where Hinduism is sort of the more nationalistic brand of Hinduism is growing stronger, and then in China, where state atheism. Again, remember, going back to the beginning of our conversation, atheism itself is a religion-like belief system. And so it's a state monopoly. But if you look what's happening inside China now, they're whipping up national fervor to the nation state, which is atheist. So that takes on a religious connotation. So in the United States, the sort of with Donald Trump and his presidency, there's also whipping up a Christian nationalism
Mm.
that I know that that's controversial, but
Yeah.
these events happened on July 6th,
Yes.
January 6th, where there was an attack on the U.S. Capitol, and outside before that, as that attack was happening, and before people were chanting "Christ our King, Trump our President," Christ our King, Trump our President. So not that all people in that crowd were um, doing that, but that's concerning, right?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
you're justifying your religion. You feel like your religion justifies aggression and,
Mm.
in fact, hate. So that's become the big problem in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that
Sorry to cut in
yeah,
there, Brian. Just on that point, I think this is so interesting. Like you say about justifying hate. I think
yeah,
there's something more insidious than that, though, isn't there? It's like that there are these kind of demagogic characters like Trump and the Chinese state and those who would put themselves up in pretty much an omnipotent position themselves. They would say, I am the authority here on earth, so to speak. But it's almost as though there's this kind of insidious association that they've made with these particular groups. And so it's assumed that if you are a part of this group, or if you are a believer in X, Y, or Z, or if you're part of this, then this is your guy, this is your party. And I find it incredibly interesting, especially when talking about the history of the 20th century, for example, and someone like Carl Jung, who was reflecting on the two world wars that he lived through, and thinking about how the state was actually supplanting God. So
yeah,
there's a fascinating quote in one of his final books that he wrote, which I've recently been reviewing, called The Undiscovered Self, where he says you can take away a man's gods, but only to replace them with others. And his great fear was that the state was taking the place of God, and it was
yeah,
supplanting religion, and that was having a detrimental impact on the individual, so
yes,
to speak. And so you end up with these mass people, and he was scared to death before he died, reflecting on the atrocities of the two world wars. He was scared to death that of what one madman can do with an organized mob of people who lack self-knowledge and who are quite fanatical in supporting that particular agenda. So that's what we're seeing here, but we're not just seeing it in terms of the state replacing God. We're seeing it, like you say, in relation to Trump and this idea that, okay, well, yeah, we're for Christ, and so because we're for Christ, we're also for Trump, and this is creating division not only in societies versus believers and non-believers, but also within different denominations themselves, because you've got people within those denominations who are saying, no, that's not what I'm signed up to. I believe in Christ as well, and Christ is king, but Trump, no, forget it. So how do you see some sort of way out of this? How can we kind of extricate ourselves from this entanglement that demagogic leaders and strongmen seem to be intent on promoting?
yeah. Well, I just to have your watchers be aware of an article they could read on this, just came out this yesterday. It's in the Atlantic, called "The Evangelical Church is Breaking Apart. Christians Must Reclaim Jesus from His Church." And so it's written by Peter Weiner, who was a speechwriter for the past Republican presidents, Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush, and he himself's of Evangelical. And he goes through and he talks in different ways with lots of examples about what we were just talking about. And his plea is Christians have to bring Jesus back into church. In other words, they've replaced it. That politics has become more of a passion than Christ, than loving loving God and loving your neighbor. So that's an interesting article to read. So I think that the answer is in greater personal relationship to 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 our faith, and to the core of our faith. And I can only speak from my own faith perspective, but I know how easy it's when you're worshiping a God that you can't actually see physically, aside from apparitions and certain things that people might experience. It's so much easier to have your diet filled with cable news, or the next thing that'll reinforce messages that the other guys are the enemy, the other guys are wrong. And so like in journalism there's a saying, if it bleeds it leads. Because people, if you can read a story, mass murderer strikes again, or local nun keeps doing good work in the soup kitchen, which one will you likely read? And no matter even how, that's just a temptation to gravitate towards the more sensational. And so I think that this demonization of the other side, whichever side you're on, is really a problem. And one of the solutions, if you want to talk about expanding this out to what it means to love our neighbor, I'm working on with a team of people and organizations on rolling out a better understanding of covenantal pluralism. And pluralism, is that productive engagement. It's not just diversity, but it's that where you have many different voices, creating a society that's stronger than it would be if everybody only ate vanilla ice cream, so to speak.
Greater than the sum of its parts, you might say. Yeah,
that's pluralism. And then covenantal, the piece of that means that we covenant together, or we agree to stand up for each other's ability to have our beliefs and act on those beliefs, behaviors, without necessarily lending moral equivalency to the other's belief. So my whatever, I might have a Baha'i friend, and I want to stand up for their right to have those beliefs, but it doesn't mean I have to agree with that faith perspective. But it also means when I engage with them and I support them and respect them and help protect them, I might be blessed in that process. I might also learn something from them that is beneficial to my own faith. And to have that perspective requires spiritual depth, spiritual confidence, that to relate to somebody else who has a different belief than me doesn't challenge my faith, and it doesn't threaten my faith. Even if that person is a person who's against all faith. To if you're with an atheist, and well, how'd you come to that belief? Just ask any atheist; they'll be glad to tell you, and they'll be glad to ask, and you'll learn something that will help you understand. Well, I see where you came from. And it's usually a hurt, or not always. Sometimes they had a bad experience with religion, but it's to understand how somebody else sees what we collectively call our faith is only helpful to better understand and respond. So that's this covenantal pluralism. It really requires you to be comfortable in your own skin, in your own faith.
Definitely.
And I think that's why Christian or Hindu nationalism, Christian nationalism, whatever the nationalism, Islamic nationalism, that becomes so much easier, because what do you have to do? All you have to do is hate the other guy and shout for my side. But to engage in that engaged covenantal pluralism requires me to actually own my faith and its values, and hope that my faith and values actually has something to say to the other person. And
Yeah.
that only comes if you're living your faith out, not just
Yes.
acting.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely. Absolutely. A lot to think about that. I've got to play devil's advocate here, Brian, because I know a lot of people are asking this question right now, and that is, we talk about Christian nationalism, we talk about Hindu nationalism, we talk about all this tribalism involving religion. Wouldn't it be better just to put religion aside and religious identity aside altogether, cut out the middleman, so to speak, and just cultivate a direct relationship with God?
Well, what happens, I mean, that's a good theory. In practice, what happens is when you try to not let religion have a place, it forces its way back in, and then attempts to force itself out, and that ends up in a war, you could say. So if something is so deeply held, within a person, and they're forced to put it under a table,
Mm.
eventually that's going to rub them really raw.
Sure, sure.
And so if it were saying, okay, we're not going to talk about, who won the match last night. We're just going to stop
Yeah,
talking about that. Yeah, maybe for some people it might rub them raw, but okay, I can understand that.
mm.
Whether it's Arsenal or Man U or whatever
Yeah,
the
yeah,
teams are,
yeah,
we'll leave that outside the door. We know that.
yeah,
We know that doesn't cut to the soul of our personhood. We can,
sure.
not bring that into the workplace. That's a little bit different than, okay, when you want my faith to remain outside. Here's an example why that just is not only can't be done because people can't pull their soul out. That would be awful.
Mm.
But on 9/11, on our website, you can see some of these videos. On 9/11, in New York City, the women who were the 911 call operators, the emergency call that goes into them, and we did a documentary with them just on the anniversary of 9/11 this year, and they were saying that they were on the phone with people in the towers, and they weren't going to get out,
Mm.
and they realized this was it, and they said, will you pray with me?
Yeah.
And if you can't bring your faith to work, what happens when there's an emergency
Mm.
and your coworker, well, these happen all the time, your coworker parent dies,
Mhm.
you know they have a deeper need, or they find out they have cancer, or whatever the light, or their kid just you know did something, landed in jail. People have deep needs
Mm.
that faith doesn't provide all the answers, but
Mm.
it does provide answers. And so, like this morning, the chief flight controller at American Airlines is also a chaplain, and he's an
Mm.
Anglican priest. And he's a certified pilot, and also he's the guy that moves all the planes around the skies. And this morning, he sends out a devotional every week. And this morning, his devotional was that he got so angry when his father later in life went totally blind, and he got angry at God, and got angry at, he's angry at the illness. And then his dad said, look, don't get angry. I have better vision than you do,
Mm.
because I can see things clearly.
Mm.
And so, right there, you had that sense that here's somebody completely blind, and we might get angry about it, but then that person has such a perspective, and they can
Mm.
share that. They can share that perspective. So faith
Mm.
comes into life, and if we disassociate it, people, so many people are addicted these days. So many people are
Yeah.
suicidal, depressed,
Mm.
and certainly faith, speaks to that.
Yes.
Maybe faith sometimes contributes to that if they have a bad.
Possibly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but at the same time, there's so many people are helped by that, and they have resources within them that can help, like that perspective on blindness.
Mm,
Uh,
mm,
so I think if you try to remove religion, that adds to more conflict,
yeah.
uh, and it makes people remove a really important part of themselves from their
Mm,
normal way they would interact.
yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. So that speaks quite strongly to the organization in terms of religion, like in terms of the work that you do. What
yeah,
about what about the individual? What about the person who is looking at the news, they're reading the news or whatever, and they're thinking, this religion is just the source of so much that's wrong in the world. It's the source of so much contention, so much tribalism, so much division, so much war, so much hatred, so much anger. I'm going to step away. I might have been raised a Catholic, I might have been raised goodness knows what, but I'm going to step away from religion altogether, and I'm going to cut out the middleman, so to speak, and I'm going to go directly to God. And I'm not going to affiliate with a religion anymore. I might be a Christian still, I might still read the Bible myself, and I'll pray to God. What would you say to that person in favor of the value of religion and the value of retaining their religious affiliation?
well, I'll just give a personal example. So in my own life, I try to practice Jesuit Ignatian spirituality. So I don't know
Mm,
if you're familiar with that, but there's it's a kind of mindfulness where you reflect on the day, and you try to identify where what parts of the day were drawing you closer to God, and that's called a consolation, and what parts or activities drew you further away from God, and that's
mm,
called a desolation. And a consolation could be, that you get fired from your job. Why? Well, because that job was eating you alive, and so
mm,
it doesn't. Consolation doesn't always mean that it's, sort of accrues to the benefit,
mhm,
in a worldly sense. So I try to live my life that way. But last week I was really busy, and I just wasn't able to, spend time praying. If I just on my own, and I went to mass yesterday, and that I was reconnected. And
mm,
if it were just up to me, I
mm,
mean, I was in a church with big organ and a beautiful choir, and just the fact we had multiple priests there, and the fact that people were living that faith out, and I got to join that, even though my week felt somewhat disassociated
mm,
from my faith in some ways. Um, if I didn't have that organized faith, I would be a poorer person, spiritually because of
mm,
it.
mm,
Um, so, I mean, that's just a personal anecdote, but there, that's actually, I'm a Catholic convert. I used to be Baptist, and
okay.
part of the reason I became Catholic was that there's so much variety in the Catholic Church, like
Mm,
Jesuits, Ignatian spirituality, or Franciscans, or
yes.
Benedictines, and each has a different sort of vocation or calling, and then it's a sort of a universal church. I can go to mass anywhere in the world, and I know
Mm,
what's going on,
yeah.
even if I don't understand the language. And all of those things are meaningful. And then, like, you mentioned my TEDx talk at the Vatican. Well, that was right. I stayed in the same hotel that Pope Francis stayed in when he found out he was being elected as Pope, and he
Mm.
went back to that same hotel and paid his bill. and and so so for me, there's a church leader who's humble. I mean,
Mm,
that is core to what Christianity is all about. God,
mm,
one of our teachings is, Christ is God,
mm,
and he came down, humbled himself, taking on the likeness of uh, of
yeah.
humans. So humility, and so I connect to that. So if I wouldn't be connected to my faith, these experiences, by being in the same place Pope Francis was, and being
Mm,
going to mass yesterday, I wouldn't have the same richness to my faith that I
Mm.
do.
Yeah, yeah. I like that answer. I like that idea that people need people. It's all very well us being left to our own devices, and okay, here's the Bible, here's the manual, here's the scripture that you read and that you study from within your particular faith. Just get on with it. It strikes me as insufficient because we always need each other, and it's not just about what we need, but it's also about what we have to contribute as well, because we go to these groups not just to take, but also to bring something as well, to look at the people who are struggling and actually be able to serve. It strikes me that when I go to church, I associate with people who in the regular course of my life I would never have anything to do with, not because I don't like those people, but because I don't work with them. They're not in the same sort of group, they don't live directly in the same neighborhood, and it brings people together from quite disparate areas of life. So even though yes, we're united in terms of faith, there's still so much diversity within that particular group as well. I want to talk a little bit about values specifically, Brian, because I think there is something, going back to that question, that kind of hypothetical question I asked about the value of religion, or the value of religion to the individual, and why an individual shouldn't just discard their religious belief and deal directly with God, so to speak. I think there's something to be said about values as well, and it's something that I alluded to him earlier, and I think it's quite useful to look at what he has to say on this in relation to Nietzsche, the German philosopher of the 19th century. And he talks about, in one of his books, I think it's The Twilight of the Idols, he talks about values in relation to society, and he was actually pretty terrified about the disintegration of values, and this idea of the death of God, as he called it, was terrifying to him. And he wasn't particularly gleeful about the death of God and borderless horizons and the handrails falling off. He was actually pretty frightened about it, and what it would actually mean when it came into play. But one particular thing that he wrote, which really interests me, is he talks about the English, and he says that for the Englishman, morality is not yet a problem. So even though in the time that Nietzsche was writing, English society was becoming less religious and more secular, nominally there might have been religion, but people were, in the terms of their actual beliefs and what they actually believe in, whether they believe in God and Christ and all the rest of it, they're actually becoming more secular. But Christianity was so well embedded in the societal institutions that people didn't even know that they were living it. So
Yes.
people were living Christian values without even knowing it, because it was so well embedded. And Nietzsche's point was actually, it's not immediately, morality is not immediately a problem because of this integratedness. And it just concerns me now. We see so much commotion in the world, and there is such a vacuum. And I feel as though the things that people like Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, and Carl Jung wrote about in the 19th and 20th centuries now seem to be coming into play. We're now seeing those things come to fruition, where there really is a vacuum. There really does, and I don't want to be too alarmist about this, but I do feel like there is a values vacuum where it's almost like anything's up for grabs. And what is the source of authority? Who do we look to? If we don't trust the church, if we don't trust the government, we don't trust all these institutions, many of which were put in place by FDR under his leadership to prevent things like World War II happening again. Who do we look to? Who do we trust if we can't trust any of these organizations? So it strikes me that the value of religion is really illustrated in that. It's really illustrated in the fact that there is this vacuum, and so many people are looking at where their anchors are. Where can they hang their hat? What is the sure foundation? And I know Christians talk about Christ in that context, and that has been the foundation for a lot of Western society for a couple of thousands of years. So I think about this, and I think, how can we? Do you have any thoughts on how that can be revived in any way, in terms of how we can maybe make the values that religion espouses, the positive values, things like you were talking about, love your neighbor, golden rule. How do you think we can maybe extract the essence of those principles from religion and make them more accessible to people who are looking to find their way in the world, so to speak?
Well, that's a big question.
Yeah.
But I'll just give it, I mean, I could give lots of thoughts, but the one place I see this working so productively and and somewhat counterintuitively are in some of the biggest corporations in America.
Mm,
So where they've opened the door in their diversity programming to allow faith as part of that, um, the the value people, and I alluded to this earlier, then people have this extra set of conscience that they're allowing to operate
mm.
because if I say, oh, you're a Christian, you let everybody know at work you're a Christian. Well, you should behave like a Christian. Well, that's a check and balance, isn't it? So
Sure.
because now, or you're a Baha'i or you're a Muslim. Well, you mean that's what all Muslims do? Then all of a sudden you're a representative for everything that is of that faith.
Mm,
And that is actually a values check and balance, because then you're trying to live up to what the ideal of
yeah.
a person of faith is. So our senior corporate advisor for the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation is Kent Johnson. He was senior counsel, senior lawyer at Texas Instruments, a big tech company, for 37 years,
Mm,
and he was also instrumental in bringing faith into the workplace.
mm,
And he did that at the same time their LGBT pride group was getting established, and he was setting up their Christian group. And the company said, "Well, we don't want any conflict. You guys work together." And
mm,
lo and behold, the head of the LGBT group was a Christian too. So
mm,
then they started working together, and they aligned values. They found a lot of common interest, and then as time went on, they found that religion didn't conflict with other things, like the Pride group. In fact, half of the Pride group are also Christian, which is
mm,
statistically, 50% of LGBT people, at least in America, or identify as Christian.
mm,
Um, and so, they were found they had shared values that they wouldn't have known about if they couldn't bring their faith to work.
mm,
And then that created bonds that have lasted to this day. That guy's name was Steve Lyle. He's retired too, but they remained fast, friends through
yeah.
the years. Even though Ken, he's wouldn't, that's in his theology, he wouldn't have a category in his church for same-sex marriage.
Mm,
Steve's married to a guy, but they found so many other areas where they shared common beliefs
yeah.
and values.
Yeah.
So, and then the last point I'll make on Kent's story, Texas Instruments, Kent said that he knew that he could observe that as faith came in, was allowed to be an identifier of people self-identifying in the company, that when some ethical problem came up, like they noticed a design flaw in some product they were making, instead of sweeping it under, they were
Mm,
more vulnerable with each other, and they also felt like they had God's watching, so to speak.
yeah.
And then they addressed them rather than sweep them under the carpet, which would be a bigger problem.
Mm,
um, so he could identify that. So I think that um, having a place where we can have the virtues, sort of in Catholics we have 7 cardinal virtues, and so letting those virtues like love and grace and and care for the poor and those kind
mm,
of feeding the hungry, letting those acts of mercy, or they're also called virtues, um, have a place, then that changes things. And that
yeah.
also goes back to love, because the graces or the mercies are all acts of love.
Mm,
And
mm,
so I think that that's how to bring religion back, is to get religion focused on acts of love, charity, another word for love, and
yeah.
acts of mercy, rather than battling on ethical issues.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, focusing on the action, and that's the thing. That's one thing that strikes me when I read the New Testament is that the scripture in James that says faith without works is dead doesn't mean
Yeah,
anything. So this whole idea that I say that I'm a Christian, therefore I'm on Trump's side or I'm with Putin or whoever is complete nonsense, because faith without works is dead, and that's just idle talk. If I align myself based on some sort of tribal
yeah,
identity, it really is. It really is. I mean, if people really believe it, if people are really committed to it, then that belief in God, that faith in God, is the ultimate check and balance, if you like, because it enables self-governance. Because there's
yeah,
God's always watching, right? It doesn't matter, if I'm in the presence of my boss or my wife or not, because God is always there, and ultimately I will be accountable to Him. Ryan, I just want to shift things slightly because we're coming to the end of time now. I just want to ask you really quickly, just what's one of the best examples that you've seen? We've talked a lot about love and the positive impact that faith can have in relation to the beliefs and the values. What is one of the most powerful examples that you've witnessed yourself of faith in action?
oh, well, I've seen so many. I think that the most powerful examples are when people are acting when others are not watching. Um,
Mm,
and they're acting, and I don't mean to be cliche, but the saint in my family is my wife, not me. And I mean, she's got a job, but she, um, in a way that was different than me, she selflessly, raised our four kids. They were born in China. We lived in China, the Soviet Union, when it was the Soviet Union, and in the Middle East. And so, just over and over, it was just those daily acts of faith in God that our kids, they learned to write in Chinese before they learned to write in English.
mm,
She was sure they'd never learn our native language, or at least be pretty handicapped in it. And but they've all, they've got one's got a law degree, one's got a medical degree, one's a physicist, and one's a nurse. They all mastered the language and accomplished. But that, just that kind of faith that there was in her life to,
mm,
uh, take what was really the focus of her life and trust God with it.
mm.
It was amazing. So, yeah, that it's hard, hard to. That's more than an act of faith. That's
Yes,
living by faith.
yes,
And sometimes people ask me, questions, and what I do now with the foundation is not, it's not a job, it's not a career, it's a calling.
mm,
And so, what, somebody asks, well, would you move to India if that, or would you move to here or there? Well, yeah, if it's a calling. And I think that's where, when I think of acts of faith, it's when people give themselves to a calling that's not a career.
yeah,
That wherever that calling takes me, and God is leading me, I'll go. So when I say I know many people, there's many who do that. There's many
mm,
who make a career out of a calling, um,
yes,
but that's different. But
mm,
it's people who are willing to give up a career to follow a calling.
mm.
I've seen so many heroes, and I have many examples, but um, that's the one. I don't know if I have time for one last example in that.
You do by me.
Okay, so one of the things that we do is we try to at the foundation, we try to shine a light on business people who are doing good,
Mm,
and advancing interfaith understanding, religious freedom, and peace around the world. One of those is Don Larson. He's the CEO of Sunshine Nut Company, the largest cashew producing company in Mozambique.
Mm.
Now, he ended up there from a calling that made him give up his career. He was a vice president at Hershey Foods, big chocolate manufacturer in the United States. He had learned all there is to know about moving products around the world. And then he had a big house and big cars, fast cars. He had a hot air balloon that was his hobby in the backyard, big swimming pool. And he said, "Is this what life is? Is this why I'm here?" And he literally had a come to Jesus moment, as they say. But he's and he just knew through his travels. He was in Mozambique, a war-torn country, cashew industry destroyed during the Civil War. He said, "I could do something and bless the people here. There's so many men were killed, and there's wives and orphans, and widows and orphans, and they can't often live together because the widows have no job and everybody's on the street." So he's now revived the cashew nut industry and set up orphanages, and he's not living the high flying executive life. But he's changing the world, and almost every supermarket in the United States now, all the major stores carry sunshine nuts, and you just go through the shopping center, and you just pick up a bag of cashews, and you don't realize the faith there was in that.
Wow, that's
so
incredible.
Anyhow, that's a different example than my wife, but it's also again, it's that same sense where you've been called to do something and you have faith that it'll work, and faith in God that God's leading you to do that. So those are the heroes of faith for me.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, and thinking about the meaning of faith from a scriptural point of view, a hope in things which are not seen but which are true, and we find out that they're true through stepping into the dark and stepping forward, putting our best foot first as well. It's really quite something, and both those examples are excellent. One of them is obviously the really big commercial story and the, like you say, the come to Jesus moment, which obviously it wasn't just obviously one event. It obviously involved several steps along the way. But I like what you said about your wife in particular, because it is very much about that consistent way of living on a day-to-day basis, not just about the monumental big thing. I mean, gosh, it should be a monumental big thing to raise 4 kids in the manner in which your wife did, and having kids that spoke Chinese. Did you say they learned Chinese before English? Yeah. So that's a monumental achievement, and for them, all of them, to go on to be successful and have good careers, that's a fantastic achievement, and it's something that really, I think, should be appreciated as such. I've got to ask Brian now. Final question. This episode's probably going to release around Christmas, and you've already mentioned that you're a Catholic. So, if I may ask, in closing, what does Christ mean to you?
So, without being overly dramatic, Christ's call on my life, Christ's example in my life defines everything that I value, and to live up to sort of that calling. He said that we all should be perfect as our Heavenly Father in heaven is perfect, is sort of unattainable. I'm nowhere close to that, right? Maybe you are, but
no, certainly not.
Well, as long as every person's honest, they would say, "Yeah, I'm nowhere near that." And then that's why the grace means so much. That his sacrificial atonement for each person is because there's that hope, there's that desire that we should all be perfect, and we just can't get there, and we need a savior. So it's sort of the all of life, but then when you dig down, it's the aspirations, and then realizing I can't attain that, and then Christ provides the full meaning in that. And the other thing I would say is, and I know this might not be theologically orthodox, but through Christ, God is accountable for how the world has turned out.
Mm.
In that, the world has plenty of problems, and the scriptures don't express it this way, but to me it means something, that God didn't just say, well, you guys screwed up, tough luck, but he I don't know if feels accountable is the right way to describe that, but did something to solve that problem of how things turned out. And I think for many people who aren't believers, this question of evil in the world and all that, how can a good God create such a messed up, place? Well, there's so much beauty in the world too. So, it's not a completely messed up place, but there are atrocities, and there's true wickedness and evil in the world that continues to happen, and God hasn't abandoned us, but in Christ has said, no, he died for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's through faith that we take advantage of the merits of Christ, isn't it? So that wraps it up nicely. Brian Grimm, thank you so much for your time on the Real Clear Values podcast.
Thank you, Tom. Great to be with you.